Benissimo, allora faccio la mia introduzione, insomma, i miei saluti e i miei ringraziamenti in italiano. Io vi ringrazio e actually this is a comeback nel mio caso e sono nella stessa situazione in realtà in cui ero 3 anni fa alla prima edizione della nostra Military History School perché allora ero stato il primo a parlare e lo sono tutt'oggi e come dissi allora, sì certo è un onore, è un piacere esserlo, ma è anche un discreto onere. Quindi io spero di non onerarvi troppo con la mia presentazione e di non essere troppo noioso. E, switching in English, actually as you can see, my title was originally planned to be in Italian, and my presentation was planned to be in Italian. But for the sake of the audience, on behalf of the audience, I decided to switch it. Ecco, grazie, meglio. And so I'm gonna deliver my presentation in English, and I hope not to bore you and not to have a very bad English. So let's go and let's start. Within historical studies, and particularly of course in military history, the concepts of rebellion and rebels resist clear or uniform definition. Indeed, defining them would require all parties involved to share or at last to reconcile their perspective. Yet, acts of insubordination, sedition, or open revolt inherently defy such consensus. As a matter of fact, a rebel exists indeed both as an actor and as a social phenomenon only when external opponents confer upon him and his group the status or the label, we can say, of a rebellion. Broader lexical definitions confirm, indeed, this duality. The Oxford Learner's Dictionary defines rebellion both as we can see in this slide, number one, an attempt by some of the people in a country to change their government using violence. That's to say, in a sense which is tied, we can say, to major political and state history. But also, definition number two, an opposition to authority within an organization, a political party, etc. That's to say, in a more general and lesser usage. These labels are almost always imposed, we were saying, externally, while they are rarely adopted, of course, by those whose actions are at issue, that's to say, by the so-called rebels. But even external sources often show inconsistencies in defining episodes of sedition. Identifying rebels has always been a very deeply and strongly political act, because declaring a faction or a region in revolt implies indeed neat judgment and partisanship. So the study examines the sharply divergent perspectives on figures and events which are commonly labeled as rebellions in ancient history. We are beginning with ancient history, of course, but especially focusing on contexts which are placed beyond the Greek and Roman classical tradition, but that are mainly attested, we must admit it, of course, right to Greek and Latin historiography, as we will see. Such sources, as we know, constantly impose many moral, rhetorical, and partisan filters that are particularly evident in accounts concerning what was, at the end of the day, the historical arch-enemy, the total enemy of the Greek world, the Greek polis, namely the Achaemenid Persian Empire, lasted from the mid-6th to the end of the 4th centuries BC. Our analysis will thus specifically deal with 2 episodes that both took place in the western satrapies of the empire, that's to say, in regions which were more closely connected to the Greek world during the early 4th century BC. So, to frame this setting, we might begin proposing a brief chronological step back, going back to before Persian rule at the time of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. But at last this was the plan I prepared when I prepared my presentation. But now, due to time constraints, I think that it's better if we directly move on to the Achaemenid period, while limiting to acknowledge that discrepancies between what we call the Eastern records and later classical reinterpretations of them are always very striking, as I am trying to show you. Maybe we will discuss later about this with these 2 examples. So, turning now to the Achaemenid period, which properly concerns us today, the Persian Empire, as we know, obviously held a central place in Greek history, in Greek politics, and in Greek ideology, making it prone to many layers of bias that still influence modern interpretations, that's to say, that still influence our understanding of not only the Achaemenid Empire, but of the whole Eastern ancient world. Within Achaemenid official communication and religious thought, however, as you can see from this quotation, the concept of rebellion went far beyond mere political insubordination, as resistance to the King of Kings implied not only political disobedience, but wholesale rejection of a cosmic order. This worldview is perfectly epitomized, indeed, in the famous Behistun inscription by Darius I, which framed, as you see, the quelling of the many uprisings broken across the empire in the two troubled years 522 to 520 BC as a sort of unrelenting struggle against treachery. And, most importantly, it proclaimed the king's duty to reward loyalty and to punish rebellion. But, by contrast, Greek and Roman sources, which are of course evenly shaped by the memory of the so-called Persian wars, completely ignored, or tended to ignore, at last, Persian religious and ideological dimensions of unrest, and they focused instead on sedition broken out, we were saying, in the western satrapies of the empire, that's to say, in Asia Minor, in the Levant, but especially in Egypt and also in Cyprus. To Greek writers, indeed, the alleged frequency of the disturbances suggests that the king's authority was constantly threatened along the eastern Mediterranean front of the empire, and rebellion, apostasy in the most used term in Greek sources, appeared indeed as an endemic factor there, and the Greek narratives, indeed, often tended to exaggerate or directly exaggerated events or conflated or tended to conflate distinct crises during the full duration of the Persian Empire. And with this, these authors strongly reinforced the long-lasting stereotype of the so-called, that's better what we call, the Persian decadence, the myth of the Persian decadence. So, therefore, our first case study, selected case study here, concerns what is called the Kypriakos Polemos, the Cypriot War, described by Greek authors as a decade-long conflict fought in Cyprus, and basically, we may add, across the entire Achaemenid Eastern Mediterranean, between circa 390 to 380 BC, so 10 years. This conflict pitted the then great king Artaxerxes II against a coalition which was then centered on Euagoras I, who was the king of the Cypriot Greek polis of Salamis. But more significant here than the highly disputed chronology of the war, which of course is not our concern here, is the seemingly universal branding of this Euagoras as a rebel. He was indeed considered such, to say a rebel, both by the Persians, of course, but also by the Greeks. But yet, Greek sources show striking variations in how this rebellion was construed, with very different emphasis on the Persian motivations for war and on Euagoras' own rule as an apostates, as a rebel. So the following examples may illustrate, at least I hope, these nuances. The earliest testimony is found in Isocrates' speech called Euagoras. This oration, as you may understand, praises the Cypriot king as a champion of Greekness, while noting that Artaxerxes II decided to attack Salamis due, we may read, to a long fear of Euagoras himself, and in a moment when the king was still receiving benefits from him. At first glance, this might suggest us, so to say, that Euagoras was innocent, implying that he had expected to have a free reign in Cyprus in light of his prior services to Persia, and without never directly harming Artaxerxes' interests. Yet Isocrates actually presents a more nuanced view on these, because although the Persian intervention was formally unprovoked and the great king's decision was nominally, we read, unjust, dikaia men upoion, it had been not entirely logical for the king to do so, to attack Cyprus, men pantapasin alogos bouleusamenos. Euagoras' actions, which had inspired Artaxerxes' fear, made, therefore, the dispatch of a Persian army and a strong Persian fleet to Cyprus highly necessary in the eyes of the king. And in fact, Isocrates implicitly acknowledges Euagoras' responsibility for the war, legitimizing his status as a rebel and a provocateur. But the idea of a Salaminian king taken by surprise by the Persian attack, yet whose actions had compelled Artaxerxes to react, appears again in a fragment of Theopompus of Chios, Philippica, which was a work of history dated basically to the mid-4th century. A synthesis of Theopompus' book concerning the time of the Kypriakos Polemos notes indeed the king was persuaded. Syunepeste is the verb used, and peito means actually to persuade, was persuaded to wage war against the Wagaras. That is to say, that Artaxerxes had been compelled, but not by external pressures, but by the circumstances created by Wagaras' own conduct. Here again, therefore, the Salaminian king emerges as a full-fledged rebel. But furthermore, a concise but useful synthesis of the main two positions concerning the Wagaras' responsibility we have just seen is offered by Diodorus Siculus' account found in Book 14 of his library, likely drawing, we must say it, on Ephus of Cumae, an early 4th century historian lived not too much later than the events. The Sicilian historian identifies two contributing causes for the Persian intervention in Cyprus. First, in his account, many rival Cypriot city kingdoms, which were then opposed, we are in year 391 BC, were opposed to a Wagaras, let's say Soloi, Kition, and Namatus, to be more precise, are said to have sent an embassy petitioning the king and portraying a Wagaras expansion in the island as a real threat to imperial control over it. But second, and directly quoting now from the text, you may see it here, the king did not wish a Wagaras to advance farther, ou bulomenos amamentu Ewagoran epipleion procopten, but he also strongly appreciated the strategic position of Cyprus and its great naval strength, whereby it would be able to protect Asia in front. Diameumenos tenciupon euphios einaicheimen, kai nautiken diunami megaleneikein, e diunesetai propolemein tesasias. Thus, from the Persian perspective, at last, a war's actions fully constituted a genuine rebellion, and this account frames the Cypriot conflict as a deliberate, planned, and strategic response to a real threat to Persian imperial authority. Yet, we have to say, Greek sources often magnified, of course, such episodes as the Wagaras revolt, applying the label of apostates even to figures who neither aimed at secession nor openly defied the great king. In fact, within the same historical and geographical frame of the Wagaras war, a second case perfectly illustrates, in my opinion, how Greek sources often misapplied the label of apostates. Its protagonist, Glus, the son of Thamos, belonged to a family which was based in northwestern Ionia. Like his father, he had served the Persians as a local and loyal Euparchos, administering many cities and harbors found on the coast, you can see it in the map, around the cities of Cumae and Phocaea, and most importantly, retaining the command over the contingents of the imperial fleet stationed there in the first decade of the 4th century. The line in light blue, which is shown in this map, represents the nautical route followed by Glus during, again, the Cypriot War, and we are circa in the year 286 BC. But despite his senior title and the important successes gained in the early stages of this war by Glus, Diodorus, who is our sole source on this, we must remember it, remembers Glus chiefly for having considered rebelling against the king. Here you are with the quotation. Diegno tu Basileus aphistestai, and he ultimately brands Glus as a real rebel from the king, apostates on to Basileus. Yet his own account, found at the beginning of Book 15 of the library, paints a more complex picture on this. Briefly, after circa 15 years of loyal service to the Persians, Glus had indeed risen to a very high position in the hierarchy of the Persian fleet, while being also tied by marriage, we learn from Diodorus, to Teribazus, who was named the supreme commander of that expedition. However, the subsequent military stalemate in Cyprus had exposed unresolved tensions between Teribazus himself and Orontes, who was the other main general of the expedition, caused The latter, Orontes, accused his rival, Teribazus, of treason to the king, and actually had him arrested, and eventually he seized the supreme command over the entire expedition. So, being bound to the fallen Teribazus, Glus found himself really deeply threatened, and he devised, using again Diodorus' word, to have and to get a new plan of action, egno kaine pragmaton in Diodorus' text. This new plan of action involved, for Glus, to leave Cyprus with ships, men, and funds, establishing its base, not surprisingly, again in northwestern Ionia. Indeed, for only 1 year and a half, starting in circa 283 BC according to the most reliable reconstructions, he focused indeed on preserving his position, on preserving his possessions, and on preserving his rank rather than openly rebelling against Persia and the great king. However, during this period, Glus neither attacked the king nor forged a supposed anti-Achaemenid front by concretely relying on his new Egyptian and Spartan friends, what Diodorus called as actual alliances, symmachia. His aim was, indeed, as we are saying, to consolidate his resources, to make pressure on the Achaemenid court, and eventually to regain favor after Teribazus' temporary fall. This prospect was, at his eyes, no doubt realistic, strongly realistic, as Teribazus was soon later restored at the Achaemenid court. But before such a hoped-for reconciliation could occur, Glus was assassinated, almost certainly, notwithstanding Diodorus' reticence on this point, by royal order. This target killing, unlike the full-scale military intervention by the Persians against the Wawras, was certainly not, and should certainly not, be interpreted as a response to a genuine rebellion by his part. Although Diodorus calls him, as we have said, an apostates to Basileus, Glus basically acted defensively, seeking reintegration rather than secession from Artaxerxes. And so his so-called rebellion reflects more the ideological framing and the ideological biases of the Greek Xerxes than any real insurrection come about in Cyprus or in Western Ionia or wherever you want. So in sum, identifying and defining one or more rebels or a rebellion is never a straightforward affair, particularly in the ancient world and when we are beyond the Greek and Roman classical context and traditions. The challenge is heightened indeed when events theoretically suited to such an analysis, theoretically suited to rebellions, are embedded in a complex web of biases, both found within the sources themselves and in the interpretive frameworks modern scholars bring from them. And here we have two examples, but I think it's better if we speak about that later. I leave you the slide just to have a quick look on this, because, by the way, from all of these, from these examples, we learn that the designation of a figure or an event as rebellious in ancient history, but not only, I may add, was neither fixed, never fixed, nor inevitable, despite the portrayals given in the ancient Greek and Latin sources. And now, to have a conclusion, but a more properly appealing conclusion, I've noticed in the last few weeks that many social media, like Instagram and Facebook, have circulated images with a supposed quotation taken from the great Italian poet, soldier and patriot Gabriele D'Annunzio, which says, "Ovunque ci sono ribelli, ivi ci sono dei fratelli." Per noi, that's to say in English, where there are rebels, there are brothers for us. Of course, this later us, noi, refers to Italians who were citizens of the Kingdom of Italy during the Great War or before it, while the rebels probably allude to other Italian communities which were still under external Austrian rule before or during the Great War. Yet this phrase seems not, actually, because I've searched about it, to be authentic, at least if it is presented in this form. And so this 20th century case, in my opinion, perfectly illustrates two lessons which are central to our study of events happened 2.5 millennia earlier about rebellion and supposed rebels. First, that sources always demand a careful verification and a precise contextualization, especially when we are talking about such complex issues. But second, that in Greco-Persian relations, so more specifically, authors like Isocrates, as we have seen, quite similarly to D'Annunzio, framed rebels within the Achaemenid Empire as brothers to the Greeks. But this was, of course, a powerful but likewise distorted construct, projecting rebellions even where none of them truly existed. Thank you for your attention. Grazie per l'attenzione.